podcast contains discussions of real criminal cases, including descriptions of violence, abuse, and other disturbing events. Some listeners may find this content too graphic or emotionally triggering. Listener discretion is strongly advised. This episode is not suitable for children or sensitive audiences. If you feel distressed at any point while listening, please consider pausing the episode and seeking professional support. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Crime KE podcast. My good name is Ajuma and I am a human rights journalist from Kenya. Now, this week we get into the murder of John Owich Odikre in January 2014. Now, just like last week's episode, I haven't seen this story reported on as much as the normal episodes that I cover here on this podcast. Now, I think this story is important because it addresses an issue that affects most Kenyans, and that is land disputes. And I am also very curious to know what your opinions and thoughts are on this case when it comes to whether justice was achieved. Now, stick around until the end to tell me what you think. Thursday, 23rd January 2014 was a normal day for Susan Kamore. Susan was a medical practitioner at the Suzamed Medical Clinic in Kayole. That was until that night when she was back at her house and she got a call from the nurse on duty for the night. She said that the nurse told her that a person who had been stabbed was lying at the front door of the clinic. Now, Susan rushed to the clinic and she found a crowd gathered around the body of a young man who looked like he had been stabbed in the neck, and his phone, a Techno, was lying next to his body. So at this point, she called the police and reported the incident. Police arrived at the medical center and they found a man lying at the front of the clinic with his phone next to him. Now, the crime scene investigating officer testified that when they arrived at the scene, they found his body on the ground with visible injuries to his neck caused by a sharp object, and his phone was right there. They took photos of the crime scene and moved his body to the city mortuary for identification and a post-mortem. Now, it was at the mortuary that they identified the man as John Owich Odikre. Now, John was a father of two and a resident of Kayole in Nairobi, but his family actually resided in Homa Bay County in Oyugis. Now, according to John's wife, who was in Homa Bay at the time of the murder, she said that she was called on the 23rd of January and told that her husband had gotten into an accident and he had ended up losing his life. So she told the area chief about what she had found out and immediately headed to Nairobi. Now, the chief is a very important part of this story, by the way. His wife said that when she arrived in Nairobi, her first stop was the city mortuary. There, she found her husband's body, and she said that she noticed that he had what looked like a stab wound to his stomach. The chief government pathologist, Dr. Johansen Odwar, conducted the postmortem on John's body, and his report showed that he had a physical injury on his neck. The pathologist said that he had found it hard to determine how long he had been dead, but he found the cause of death to be exsanguination due to a slash wound on the neck. Exsanguination is the medical term for death caused by the complete or nearly complete loss of blood from the body. Now, it literally means draining of blood. And in forensic or pathological contexts, it refers to fetal hemorrhage, where the body cannot sustain life due to insufficient circulating blood volume. Now, very early in the investigation, suspicion landed on John's brother, who was identified as George Opio Odikre. I'll call him George in this episode. Now, the police say that after they started interrogating people in the family and those close to the family, they found that George had been threatening John with murder for some time leading up to his death. Now, the investigating officers say that they first heard the rumors of George's involvement at John's funeral meeting. The officer testified that at the funeral meeting, some of John's cousins were accusing another one of John's cousins named Jacob of being the one who committed the crime, together with John's 17-year-old brother, Kelvin, and their neighbor, a man named Wycliffe. And they believe that the three of them were financed by George to murder John because the two were actually in a dispute involving their ancestral land in Oyugis. Now, according to testimony from one of the cousins who was living with Kelvin at the time of the murder, he believed that Kelvin and Jacob were involved in the murder because one, he said that he had seen the two of them with a new kitchen knife just 5 days before John was murdered in a stabbing. Two, he said that on the day of the murder, Kelvin did not sleep in their house. He testified that he was suspicious that on the day that Kelvin failed to return home, his older brother turns up dead in a knife attack. He also told the court that he confirmed Jacob did not also sleep at his place that night, which made it more suspicious. Now, three, he said that on his way to report the murder to the police in the morning, after he found out about the murder, he actually met Kelvin, and when he asked him to accompany them to the police station, he refused. Now, he also said that Kelvin was very uncooperative when it came to planning John's funeral arrangements, and after John's death, he immediately moved from their house in Kayole to another house in Kibra. Now, to this cousin, it seemed like Kelvin's actions immediately before and after John's murder pointed to him being guilty and very suspicious at least. Now, based on the information gathered in the investigation, police arrested Jacob, Kelvin, and Wycliffe for interrogation. According to court documents, during one of the interrogation sessions, the three of them mentioned George as the financier of the plan because he was apparently mad about a land subdivision issue. Now, the investigative officer said that Wycliffe even confessed to having tried to murder John at least 3 other times and failing. So George was also taken into custody, and now the police had 4 suspects in John's murder case, and they were building a whole case of murder. The investigators first traveled to the brothers' ancestral home in Oyugis. Now, according to the investigator's testimony, when he went there, he confirmed that there was animosity between George and John because of their father's land. And also, he found that a police report had been made because George had been threatening John's life leading up to his death. Now, John's father had 2 wives. George and Kelvin came from the first wife, and John came from his second wife, and he was the only son of his father's second wife. At this point that this story is happening, all their parents were dead, and their father had left behind an estate to be divided among his children. Now, when John married his wife and took her home in 2013, he built them a house inside George's compound because he was the brother who remained at home after their parents died. So basically, he just built his house inside their father's compound, only that this time it belonged to George. His wife testified that earlier in their relationship, John told her that his relationship with George was not good because they would always get into arguments over their father's property. She said that the couple lived in George's compound for a while before the two had a quarrel and George told them to move out. At this point, John obviously needed land to build a new house for his family. His wife told the court that when John asked for land, he was given a portion at the lower side of the land and another portion close to the house. Now, what triggered the new dispute was that George stopped John from using the land he had given him to farm. Now, John escalated the issue to the area chief and reported his concerns. The chief reached out to George and they agreed on a meeting date to try and resolve the issue between the two of them. Now, the chief says that during the meeting, he initiated a subdivision of the land according to tradition, but George was unwilling to allow it. The chief said that he went ahead with the subdivision anyway because he had already had both sides of the story and he felt that this was the right thing to do. Now, when the day of the subdivision came, George did not turn up for the meeting because he was unwilling to subdivide the land in the first place. So they went ahead and did it in his absence. And finally, George had a place to build his house and plant food for his family. Now, days passed and the brothers got into another argument again because George apparently started messing with what the chief had done during the subdivisions. John returned to the chief and reported that his brother had uprooted the beacons that had been put in place during subdivision, and he had also threatened to quote-unquote finish him. Again, the chief called them for a reconciliation meeting to help them resolve the issue again. But John said that it was not effective because George kept threatening him and they kept getting into arguments because of this land. On 2nd of September 2013, John reported threats from his brother at the Odoro police station in Homa Bay. According to the officer on duty that day, he recorded John's statement of receiving threats over land on the 2nd, and on the next day, the 3rd of September, they arrested George. Now, while in police custody, George apologized and promised to replace the beacons that he had interfered with, so he was released. After that, in December 2013, John left home for Nairobi, and in less than a month, he had been attacked and stabbed in cold blood. Now, one other reason that they thought that George was involved in John's murder was that he had apparently sold some of his belongings and relocated to Kisumu after he heard of the news of John's death. Now, those in the village after that assumed that he was running away because this was the same time when rumors started going around that he had sent Kelvin 20,000 shillings to kill their brother. The four suspects, that is Jacob, Kelvin, Wycliffe, and George, were arraigned in February of 2014. That is a month after John's murder. They all pleaded not guilty to the murder charge. Now, according to court documents, the trial officially began 2 years later, on February 1st of 2016. During the period of the trial, they were all in remand, and since Kelvin was 17 years old and a minor at the time of the crime, he was placed in a juvenile detention facility. The prosecution in the case began presenting their arguments in July 2017, which is more than 3 years after the murder. And I think I'm saying this to show the timeline of justice in this country. The prosecution presented 13 witnesses to testify in the case, including John's wife, the chief, the investigating officers, the pathologists, and even some of John's cousins. Now, some of the things that came up in court were that George had not only threatened John, but he had also threatened his cousin, the one who reported the murder to the police, and he had also threatened their grandmother, who had tried on several occasions to mediate some of their conflicts with John. Now, all the cousins who testified say that they learned about the plan at the funeral meeting and after seeing the suspects' behaviors after the murder. Now, one of the cousins who testified during trial say that during the funeral, Wycliffe told them that he knew what had happened and they even tried to convince him to confess. Now, Wycliffe then apparently told them that Kelvin was supposed to give him money for the murder, which he had received from George. He also testified that Wycliffe confessed to him that the motive for the murder was the land disputes that they had with John. The cousin also testified that the man who actually carried out the stabbing was called Jemo, and he had just disappeared into thin air after the murder. So this cousin's story was that Jacob, Kelvin, and Jemo carried out the murder, and George paid the money to facilitate the plan. The investigating officer testified that he believed that if George hadn't been arrested, he would have gone after his own grandmother. The chief, a clan elder, and the officer from Oyugis confirmed that they divided the land in George's absence because he refused to show up. Now, after close to 3 years of testimonies from the prosecution, they ended their case on 20th May of 2020. The defense began their case 2 years after that, on 26th July of 2022. Again, the timeline of justice. The first witness for the defense was Jacob, who was the first accused. He gave a sworn statement where he denied murdering John or even being involved in the planning of the murder. In fact, he told the court that the last time he saw John was in October 2010, which is more than 3 years before he was murdered. He said that there was no dispute between John and his brothers, and he also had no grudge with him that would lead him to murder. Jacob confirmed that he had bought a new kitchen knife on 10th January 2014, that is more than 10 days before the murder, but he did not stab John. Kelvin, who was the second accused, took the stand next in his defense, and he also denied being involved with his brother's murder. Now, in his testimony, he said that he was working at the Kenya Cinema Bar on the day of the murder, and that was why he did not sleep in the house. He said that just because he did not sleep in the house does not mean he was out committing murder. He said that he was an artist at the time and he was working on that night at the Kenya Cinema, and he finished work at around 6 a.m. and that was his story and he was sticking to it. The third defense witness, Wycliffe, who was also the third accused in the case, denied even ever knowing John. George was the last witness on the stand, and he testified that there were no disputes between him and John, especially a dispute involving land. He explained that the only reason he was opposed to the subdivision was that he believed that their father had bought John's mother land before they died, so he did not see the reason why he should divide his land when John had land that his father had bought for his mother. He denied sending money to Kelvin so that they could execute John's murder. And finally, he told the court that he told John to move out of his compound because they had so many fights with his wife and he just wanted peace in the home. Now, after the two sides presented their arguments, the presiding judge determined that the prosecution's case was very circumstantial. One, because there were no actual witnesses to the crime, and two, because the prosecution did not prove any malice or even premeditation. Now, according to the judge, the prosecution failed to prove some of the basic and important evidence in the case. For example, they did not provide evidence of a transaction from George to Kelvin for the murder, not even an M-Pesa message. He said that they also did not try to explain why Jemo, the guy who supposedly carried out the stabbing, was not in court. The judge said that a new knife does not equal murder, and apart from the threats, no evidence proved that all the four of the accused had a common intention to murder John. So in February of 2023, the High Court in Nairobi quashed all the charges against the four accused and set them free. The judge said that the prosecution had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and suspicion is not a basis for conviction under Kenyan law. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this episode. You can support Crime KE podcast by sharing these episodes with your friends so that we can get a larger community to listen to these cases. You can follow the podcast on Instagram at crime.ke, and you can find me on Facebook at Ajuma Millicent for updates on the cases covered on the podcast. I have tagged the podcast contact information and social media pages in the show notes of this episode so that it is easier for you to reach out if you have any feedback on this episode or the podcast in general. Don't forget to give the podcast a 5-star rating on Spotify and catch the next episode of Crime KE podcast on Thursday next week on the same platform you're listening from right now. But until then, stay safe and remember, it is crime with a K. Bye.